Hey, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Email Never Sleeps. I'm Andrew Kordek. I'm with iPost, and I'm pretty excited for our guest today. It's Clay Sharman. He's the co-founder or founder of a company called Krateo.AI. And Clay, give us a little bit about your background because I got a couple questions for you about your background, which is interesting. But tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Krateo.
Sure. Yeah, great. Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's great to be here. Yeah, as you stated. My company is Krateo.AI. My background is in sort of solution development for federal contractors primarily. Got
Yeah.
into the Department of Defense, supporting the Air Force and the Navy for a while. That's where I got introduced to machine learning and the very early nascent AI conversations. But about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to dive into enterprise intelligence as it relates to national security. So I was working with some of our three-letter agencies, helping
Yeah.
develop custom solutions around insider threat detection, bad actors, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And, that's actually where I sort of got the framework in my mind for what has become Cradio, this idea of uncovering what's behind the anonymous. And so, it turns out that the world of aliases and
Yeah.
anonymous traffic is not all that different. And then so
Yeah.
taking them down to an identity and then finding out what you can about behavior or intent. So anyway, that's my background is rooted in solutions. I didn't grow up in the
Yeah.
MarTech space, so I think
Well,
I think Cradio attacks the problem slightly different.
it's you have such a unique background, right? I mean, who would have thought that working on national security and a variety of other things would lead into something that I think helps marketers, right? And we talked before we did this recording once, and I've done my research. And one of the things on your site, and this is a controversial thing, and we're going to talk about email and digital, right?
Right.
And you guys have in there, stop losing warm prospects every month. And they identify, your solution identifies, scores, and activates anonymous visitors, right? And so it kind of adds things to the funnel. But what you and I talked about before was responsible, being responsible and
Right.
doing it ethically, right? And so what I'd love for you to do is, it's a unique value proposition, and there's two sides to this
Sure.
thing around identifying prospects and then utilizing that for marketing or retargeting or whatever. I'd love for you to provide just sort of a groundwork or a framework for what you think about ethically and responsibly, and how, as you sort of grown the organization and as you continue to work with clients, how does that translate to what you guys do?
Yeah, so first, I think you have to look at the source of data that you're, kind of bringing in order
Mhm.
to identify. So are the partners you're working with, are they collecting ethically? And so you got to do a little bit of due
Mhm.
diligence on that. You want to find out what methods and mechanisms are they doing? How are they making sure that they're secure, and are they on the right kind of technology that protects data? So
Mhm.
that's priority alpha, right? Is starting that out. And then from our side, just because you have access to data, it doesn't mean that you instantly put it into place. So I think you sort of
Mhm.
tease that nicely.
Yeah.
Our take was what is the kind of information that doesn't really broach personally identifiable information,
Mhm.
but can be very relevant to the brand, that A is transparent, which is we think is an important relationship building, is that the brand should take the first step, right?
Mhm.
Tell your web visitors
Yeah.
that you'd like to do better with the marketing, that you want to collect the data in order to use it for the right purposes, which is make their
Mhm.
experience more personal. And then you have to abide by that. Don't overwhelm them. And then obviously you've got to give them a very clean way to say no, thank you, right? And so
Mhm.
we definitely are a fan of giving the consumer the choice to be collected on or not.
That's important. And so for everybody listening, we start talking about educating brands because, as you know, marketers out there today, they have this sort of um, approach of, hey, I need more people to to dispatch my marketing messaging to, right? And so there's this huge education around how do we acquire new leads or customers or subscribers or potentials, and then throw them into funnels and do a variety of different things. And there's a lot of false information, right? A lot of misconceptions.
Right.
If as you continue to, like we said, grow your business and talk to customers, there's this probably initial misconceptions that you encounter all the time. What what are those, and how do you dispel them, right? And I know you talked a little bit about the quality of the data, but are there any other like objections that people have when it comes to this type of technology?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Andrew. And of
Yep.
course the answer is yeah, there are, right? I think most of those misconceptions come with this fear of reprisal, this idea that we're a litigious society, and
Mhm.
if you step out of compliance,
Right.
uh, you're a target.
Right.
So, being sensitive to that, we want to make sure that's how we kind of came to our own answer to that. So, the objection typically, of course, is how do you collect data on people who didn't say that you could?
Yeah.
And so that's the primary one that we hear the most. And I think it's important to understand that all brands as the property owner of their website,
Hmm.
they are taking steps, presumably campaign outreach or some sort of efforts to drive traffic in, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so, anybody that comes into a website voluntarily
Hmm.
is now first party data and potentially marketable too. And then where the differentiation hits is where did they opt out of marketing collection, right? If
Right.
yes,
Right.
then we don't collect data on them either. If no, then
Right.
we can, and so that's the lens that which all things from a data privacy standpoint in the US are
Hmm.
measured.
Hmm.
If they didn't opt out, especially
Hmm.
when it comes to email,
Right.
they did actually opt in because every company has a data privacy policy.
Right.
And now if they've done it right, it's
Right.
accessible and
Yep.
any visitor can look at it and
Yep.
then find the way to opt out. It's
Yep.
onerous, right? And of course it's intentional. What we certainly recommend with all of our brands is if you want to be transparent and build trust, put the banner up front
Yeah.
that says we want to do better with you. Do you
Hmm.
accept? Do you reject? If you do either of those things, that's a great auditing trail for
Right.
us. And
Yeah.
it's a great way to start so that the visitors aren't caught off guard later down the ride.
You made me chuckle there for a second because a dork like me does read privacy policies, does kind of get into it, and I'm not going to preach to say that I read them all the time. I read them when I feel like I've been violated, right? Like,
Correct.
what is it that I missed or whatever with this X brand, right? Around that, and it's interesting because there are quite a bit of brands that practice or don't practice what they sometimes preach, and that
Absolutely.
that that is that I think is the trust factor, right?
Right.
in
Right.
in 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 customers, in customers not trusting brands, and then people kind of having, at least purists in the industry would say what you're doing is not cool. The other thing is, and I want to talk about this before I kind of get into the fundamental problems, right, that we're trying to solve here.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about the use of AI today, generative AI, how all these different things are changing the world. And, we kind of get into it in email marketing, and I'm very bullish on AI. We've been doing AI in email for many, many years. There's a lot of things that happen that involve AI that perhaps maybe even as marketers, we don't really understand.
Sure.
Krateo.AI, what is it about AI that you guys are leveraging just to educate even further when
Right.
people are like, I don't know what AI does, right? Or how does it invoke into, capturing lost revenue?
Yeah. Great question. Fair question.
Yeah.
So in our case, we wanted the foundational technology to actually
Yeah.
be artificial intelligence. So, for those people who aren't fully aware, there's a whole bunch of tiers that fall up underneath artificial intelligence
Hmm.
and machine learning, which has been
Hmm.
which has been around for 30, 40 years,
Yeah.
is, the direct offspring of
Mhm.
artificial intelligence. Actually, or maybe it's inverted, maybe it's the parent of. But in any case, modeling has been a data tool for ever since databases were sort of created and queries were available, right? So
Yeah.
we didn't have to reinvent the wheel there. What we wanted to do was essentially apply the statistical analysis and the simulation speed capabilities of a typical artificial intelligence machine learning model to
Hmm.
the volume of visitors that come in. So for us,
Yeah.
AI starts with, it doesn't do anything to identify you. That's analytics and all that other stuff. But
Right.
what we use it for is, Andrew Kordek and
Yeah.
Clay Sharman, we may have two totally different experiences on the same website.
Yeah.
And the
Right.
artificial intelligence's job is to determine which of the two of us, or maybe both of us,
Right.
are a better prospect, um, shouldn't be prospected to. So we use AI to
Mhm.
score each individual based on behavioral values.
Okay. Got it. Got it. So it's sort of like when I was asked a question many years ago when I was speaking in Australia about how do I feel about scoring systems, right? Of people. And I kind of gave a half-assed answer around, B2B. And now it's kind of more carried over in, direct to consumer brands,
Right.
and stuff. But I think it's even more important when we start talking about we don't necessarily know who that, or we don't have actual data on that person purchase history or any of that kind of stuff. At one point in time in my research, I found out that you said something that to the effect of like 98 or 95% of website visitors kind of remain anonymous. I'm curious, people who run e-commerce businesses or businesses in general, right, that rely on non-anonymous based web traffic, right? What,
Yeah.
what does it actually cost, right? Like, what does it cost somebody on the other end, right? On the organization's end.
Well, so statistically, and
Yeah,
I just happen to dug into this myself,
yeah,
digital marketing spend for 2025 is expected to be about $450 billion. The total e-com marketplace for 2025 is expected to be
yeah,
about 1.1 trillion.
yeah,
But for digital spend, it's estimated that out of the gate, without doing anything, just running your SEO to drive traffic,
right,
and trying to anything, you lose up to 40% of marketing costs instantly. So figure you're up to 110, 115 billion dollars of that 450 is waste, all the way up to 180 billion, right?
yeah,
So
wow,
you
wow,
have, and so that's what the brands are losing instantly by not knowing anything about that anonymous traffic, uh,
right,
right out of the gate. And then, of
right,
course, you overlay not knowing the right stuff, right?
yeah,
And
right,
it
yeah,
would just be the same thing as you may
yeah,
have the right scope, but if you're
yeah,
targeting the completely wrong area, then it
right,
doesn't matter when you're ready to go to execute, you're out of the game. You're nowhere, you're
yeah.
not even you're in the wrong playing field entirely.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, when we start thinking about identifying these anonymous visitors, right? And the things that you can do when we have that information and use the scoring system and want to create marketing campaigns. I don't care in which channel,
Right.
right? But we often we as a marketer, as a lifelong marketer, right? We get giddy when a new lead comes in or somebody comes in and we're able to like go, "Oh, I want to tell them everything about it or tell them what's on sale or tell them how great we are, and then there's this kind of, and I don't mean be crass when I say this, right? It's kind of like the dog humping the leg, right?
That's
Like
it.
we want to literally jump on it and do a lot. And I think this kind of furthers the fact of that if you use a solution like yours, right, you need to be very careful in what you do so you don't look like a complete jackass, right?
Right.
When
That's right.
you get a hold of this data and it requires, I don't know, to me it would require a lot of thinking of how do we want to message these people and what type of style and tone that we want to message these anonymous visitors now turned into a potential of something, right?
Right.
How does it identify? You said you have a whole data stack, right? But
Right.
in layman's terms, right, consider me to be a layman person of not knowing a heck of a lot of AI and how it does this, how the technology works. Put to rest maybe my fears of how does your technology work or any technology in general to identify these anonymous visitors, and what happens when I land on a site and let's say I am want to remain anonymous even though I don't. What happens? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So if you think about I mean, it doesn't matter what you and I could argue or dispute
Hmm.
facts. The reality is
Yeah.
our data, every one of our data is out there in some way, shape, or form. And
Hmm.
so what we're trying to do is figure out what can we what can we tell about this anonymous group that's useful but not intrusive, right? And so we use the same technology you would anticipate um, any other company that's collecting data to try and do, right? So
Hmm.
information around the device you're using, information around the browser you're using, information
Hmm.
around the IP address if we can collect it. So getting some geography around it.
Okay.
And then bouncing all of that stuff off each other essentially in order to build confidence. So, I
Hmm.
can't speak to how everybody does it, but I know for
Right.
us,
Yeah.
we build around a notion of consensus. So we need a majority of our data sources to agree that
Hmm.
this person or email address is the one that was on the site at the time of, at the site of. And so
Hmm.
that's where we start. So we start with a confidence level. It's built around this notion of consensus, data sources that have agreed.
Hmm.
We actually use IP address as more of a validation than an identifier. So
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's too many things that can go wrong in the IP world.
Yeah.
And then, and then of course the ultimate verifier is the campaign and then the response, right?
Right.
Gives us the 100%.
Hmm.
And so, the visitor that we try to do, first things first, can we find their email address? Can we agree that that's the email address? And then
Hmm.
if we can,
Hmm.
we will attempt at that point to see what other data is associated with that email address that we
Right.
can agree on is the right
Right.
information. So,
Right.
and that's intentional. The demographic stuff is great for allowing messaging to be tailored.
Right.
It doesn't help you in understanding intent, but it does help you, craft. You brought it up. You have to speak to these people a little differently.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
the more you know about them to be nuanced in your conversation, the more likely you're going to start getting a response that's positive.
So I'm going to put on my privacy or compliance hat right
Sure.
here and be this purist and go, well, wait a minute. You're collecting this data. How do you do it ethically
Right.
and stay within privacy regulations? Like, help me understand that because it sounds to me, right, like that's an invasion of whatever it is out there that's on me. I already know
Yeah.
the answer to this, but I want to hear from you,
Sure.
right? As the founder of Krateo, right?
Sure. So in the US, there are specific state laws. There's no federal data privacy law. So states have their own. CCPA, California's
Mm-hmm.
Consumer Protection Act, is sort of the gold standard at the moment. It's the
Mm-hmm.
one that almost every other state, and not all 48 lowers or Alaska and Hawaii have adopted any privacy, but they
Mm-hmm.
all sort of follow the standard. In the US, the only method for exclusion from data collection on a website for marketing purposes is the expressed opt-out model. And
Mm-hmm.
so anything other than an express opt-out is by definition opt-in, whether it's express or implied. So
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
it becomes kind of commensurate to the brand
Yeah.
to use the data responsibly, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so that we're sort of the tip of the spear, yes. And unfortunately, I can't mandate ethical, responsible use. So what we do is
Right.
we don't deliver all the data that we can collect on a person.
Yeah.
We don't
Yeah.
do it. So we give
Yeah.
what we think is just the bare, I'll call it the bare minimum to get the bare maximum.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of email, it's a different world for email
Hmm.
outreach than it is for SMS, right?
Sure.
SMS outreach is express opt-in. So
Yes.
in
Yeah.
that case, they have to say absolutely yes. And so,
Mhm.
you know, we often don't really even try to collect telephone numbers for that reason, because again, we're not trying to override people's
Right.
decision to stay private. I look at it a little bit like the brick and mortar, the old brick and mortar store. If you set
Hmm.
up your storefront
Yeah.
and you have no mechanism for introducing yourself to people who come in,
Yeah.
they are free to walk in and walk out.
Yep.
But
Yep.
but do they have the right to stay anonymous when they walk into your property?
Right.
And that becomes sort of the question, right? And so
Right.
in my mind, all we're really trying to do is give the store owner of the e-com site a method to essentially greet everybody. Say,
Yeah.
hey, my name's Clay. I'd love to help you.
Right.
Now, you know there are people in the back who are skulking around the aisles that don't want to talk to anybody. And
Sure.
so in our world, I would say that's the low intent viewer who
Yep.
who doesn't really have any interest. So what we're trying to do is, can we discard that person? We don't want to bother that person. The
Right.
point is, we only so of that 100 people that came in, we figure 10 are going to be more interested than 90.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
falls to us to not invade the privacy of the 90%, but we absolutely want the brand to be able to speak to that 10
Right.
who just didn't get an opportunity to walk up and introduce themselves. And so
Yeah.
it really is a balancing act, Andrew, as you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
So we have to be able to understand what represents lack of interest as much as interest. So that's
So
where the model comes in.
about 6 years ago, I was presenting at a conference, and I tend to say some polarizing things. And I was in front of a couple hundred marketers, and I was presenting around privacy and compliance and how it relates to email. And I made the statement of, as Americans, not as the world,
Right.
we really could give a flying fig about our privacy,
Absolutely right.
with the exception of a few, right? With the exception of few people. And then you hear the complaints, right, of people like, I want a more personalized experience. I want people to know who I am. I want this. Yet we wear these things on our wrists or our fingers, right, to track everything that we do, or smart refrigerators, or all this that's collecting all of this data about us. But yet I don't want to be tracked online. I don't want to have any of this stuff. And so there's this invasive, like, oh my gosh, I'm the victim in all
Yeah.
of this, right? And yet we don't necessarily stop to realize all this. And I think what has happened is, when we start talking about using data for power, right, and using it for ethically sourcing it, and then ethically using the data that we have for that person, there's this fine line. You're never going to make everybody happy. You're certainly going to piss some people off, but that is a part of marketing. That is a part of what you want, or at least what the studies that probably you and I read of. Everyone wants the brands to know them, have more personalized experience. And then you hear the marketers say, we want to give our people the more personalized experience. But there's this push pull. And then as a marketer, we're afraid, right?
Right.
We're afraid sometimes to get this data, that we're going to mess it up and look like idiots if we tend to go sort of overboard. So this is what I'm saying, everybody, is we can get the data. We just need to make sure that we're the ones that are in control of that data, and that we use it like if it was our own family or somebody that's marketing to me. And that's really important, right? And you hear about the CCPAs of the world and all of these other, I don't think, at least in my lifetime, I don't think that there's going to be a national federally regulated privacy, right? This is not GDPR in the EU, right? And how crazy and crazily awesome they are tuned into their privacy, because we as Americans were like, oh, data breach of healthcare information, okay. Oh, credit card data breach, okay. Like, we're okay with it. Like, it's just
Right.
it's a weird thing. And that's where I will argue my point to any marketer that basically says, if you want to get better, if you want to do things better, you need the data, but you need to do it responsibly. So, speaking of that, when we start talking about increasing privacy regulations or the elimination of third-party cookies, how is this? Maybe what does that future hold? Is it going to change the way we do things or not?
Yeah, so Google has sort of held ecom hostage for about 7 years, right? Threatening to get rid of third-party cookies.
Yeah,
And then at the start of 2024, effectively, they said, you know what,
yeah,
we're gonna let them stay.
yeah,
They tried to sort of phase stuff out and then ultimately kind of gave up the fight. I think what I would say, and I think maybe where you were headed, Andrew, was
yeah,
in understanding and controlling your own data, you
yeah,
have to build up your pool of first party data. And
yeah.
so for the people who are not quite sure, first party data is anything that's direct affiliation to your brand, and
Hmm.
website traffic falls within that purview. And
Hmm.
so owning as much of the data, and this is important, right, that you've already paid for, all of your SEO efforts, all of your marketing efforts are geared towards driving people toward your brand.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so retaining as much of that data as you can in order to do exactly what you said, which is analyze, study it, understand it.
yeah,
We've gotten, um, and this is a broad stroke statement, not intended to offend all marketers, but
yeah,
the black box turnkey solutions are wonderful, right? You put a nickel
yeah,
into the gumball machine, you get a gumball out, but you don't
yeah,
get to pick the color of the gumball,
yeah.
so it
Right.
may or may not be the one you want. And a
Yeah,
turnkey black box solution is very much like that too. Whoever
yeah,
they is, determine the
uh,
data they're going to share back to you.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that to me is not the way you transparently build a relationship with your audience and then call it trust, right? Because
Hmm.
as you pointed out, you're letting somebody else make the decisions on your behalf,
Yeah,
representing you with
yeah.
the hopes they're representing you ethically, fairly, whatever.
Hmm.
You don't get any insight into what they do in order to get results. That's their secret sauce, that's their business, and stay out, right?
Yeah, totally.
So I happen to
Totally.
agree with you, Andrew, that control of your own data is not a data privacy thing. It's a data responsibility thing.
Yeah.
If you treat these people like you actually want a relationship with them, that's sort of the first phase of trust building. But
Right.
we as brands, we have to do the outreach first. I think we've spent a lot of time thinking we'll just wait till the right people come find us.
Hmm.
But that's
Hmm.
not, that to me is transaction. Relationship building is you're going to make the outward effort yourself too.
Yeah. And I've said this for many years as a digital marketer, right? Whether you're in charge of all of marketing or an email program or SMS or whatever, right? Anything digitally, you are responsible for the protection and the experience of whoever you're contacting. And you have to sort of treat it like it's your house and you're not going to play with matches inside your house.
Right.
And I've often heard marketers complain to me, yeah, but Andrew, my boss, the VP of this or the CM of this or the C-suite, see that we have all this data and you see them rubbing their hands together like, "Ooh, we're going to do some amazing, sort of things. And let's just keep doing this, right? And going after these people. And this is where you need to sort of buck up and as a marketer and protect and be a protector, but also be a tester and also have the ability to stand up to say, before we go any further, let's do some testing around whatever, sending all these different marketing messages to these people. And that is a part that is a huge non line item responsibility in your job description, right? And you have to sort of treat it like your own. And I always say, if I ever go back to the client side, I might be fired within a month because I would basically tell somebody to go jump in a lake if we're going to do something that's just asinine, right?
Yeah,
Subscriber base. I want to take you, we've got a couple minutes left. I want you to take me to something that it was surprising to you as a use
sure.
case, right? Tell me a little bit about somebody that maybe had some trepidation or maybe didn't have any, but what was something that just like came out of the use of Krateo that you were like, holy crap, this is awesome, right? And
Right.
we all have negative stories. I like to stay positive, but give me something that was awesome.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I can give you something that was awesome because early in our, sort of evolution, we had one of our earliest onboardings, a
Yeah,
kind of a, well, not even kind of, a drink manufacturer, specialized keto based, good for the brain, all of that
yeah,
good stuff. They were a 100% direct to consumer. They used their
yeah,
website as an outreach e-com subscriber type of thing. But what we were seeing as we were pulling in the data of their traffic, there was a small but mighty group of B2B prospects coming through at the same time. They at first expressed no interest in B2B because they're like, hey, look, we go direct to consumer.
right.
So on a lark, we popped open the data just to see who we were talking about. And in this case, we were talking about a CM of a large national fitness chain, a gym that kept showing up on their site, but not engaging with them. But ultimately, when we showed them, hey, look, this person has showed up 14 times in the last 60 days, and
Yeah,
they stick around, they go through your product line, we could see this, it might warrant a conversation. So long story short, they reached out, and then that became the largest partner affiliation in their company because
mm-hmm.
now their drinks are in every one of the gym's cafes across the entire country. And so
Nice.
they had no idea that that was even an option to explore because they were tunnel focused on talking to their audience and understanding segmentation and campaigning differently. It never occurred to them that there was a partner opportunity within their own web traffic. And so that was
Yeah.
probably my favorite use case because we hadn't thought of that one either.
Yeah. It's funny how you can uncover certain things when you have that information, right? And every I always ask e-commerce marketers kind of the same question sometimes, like, hey, who's your most ideal customer? And sometimes they say what I would consider to be the golden rule, 23 to 49-year-old females with $100,000 in disposable income. Well, great. Yeah, of course, right? Like that's like the holy grail of customers. But when you dig deep in the data, your best customers might be something else. In this case, you uncovered somebody that maybe they never even thought about. And so
Absolutely.
this is where I think the conversion of anonymous web traffic and the ability to draw insights might give you new revenue opportunities. And I think you kind of clearly state that on the site, and most people do when they start talking about converting anonymous traffic. And again, it sort of boils back. So one final question that I have for you, and I want to do a quick wrap up. Look, you've got maybe e-commerce marketers or marketers in general, publishers, whatever, listening to this podcast. Um, and they often struggle, right? They're given unreasonable, sometimes goals to grow the subscriber base or create more sales. And let's assume that there's an attribution model in place, right, to track all of this stuff back. But they're given these sort of things, but there's this struggle within them, right, to convert their website traffic because they hear internal pushback or they read the purists who are very anti this. What piece of advice would you give them? What's sort of that card that they can draw to show somebody to say, look, this stuff kind of works, or at least we can go through a test. Like what would you tell them?
Well, I would sort of probably go back to what you said earlier, which was, you have a responsibility to test the data and you are responsible for your outreach. So
Yeah,
the way I would frame it is you may understand your ICP, yes, but
yeah,
what you likely don't understand is your ideal prospect profile, that shopper who
right.
is not anything, can be totally different. To your point, 23 to 49, yes, sure, great, we
Hmm.
love them. But if your web traffic is 55 and up, the stats don't lie either, right? And so
Hmm.
you need to
Hmm.
learn what your ideal prospect profile looks like too.
Hmm.
And then once you develop those two funnels, you've got the funnel that works, right? You get that 2 to 5% conversion every time you go out. And that's what your CMOs and CEOs are saying, do more of that, do more of that. But your web traffic is typically vastly different from that.
Yeah.
And so that funnel needs a different touch, right? A more
Mhm.
nuanced touch. But I imagine, yes, everybody wants that transactional conversion immediately. But what if you could double your conversions over 60 days instead of 30 days in that secondary funnel
Right.
because you learned how to talk to these people? So my
Mhm.
advice is, now that you have some data to study it, test it. Your messaging over here will not typically work over here. You got to come up with
Mhm.
a secondary language.
Right.
But once you do, what you know about your conversion group
Yeah.
can help inform how you move the prospect to a conversion. It's just
Right.
going to take more time.
Right.
But
Right.
that's not a waste of time. It's a good use of time. And
Yeah.
now it's a good use of data because you have access to it. And that's my advice is pick two
Right.
funnels and pay attention to both.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I'll add on to that, everybody, because I think that if you try, right, a solution like Krateo.AI, you said the word study your data, right? Oftentimes we as marketers, we like to just go, let's start sending
Yes.
out, right? Like, let's create funnels and start sending out messages and retargeting them. I would take a step back for a moment and try to better understand who are these people first, and then try to align the value proposition, the messaging, and then a few other things before you start creating campaigns, right? Because to me, you can come out of the gates at 100 miles an hour and it might fail for you. And then you're like, ah, I'm not going to do
Right.
this anymore. Right. So don't jump the gun, right? Do the research, especially if it's something that's completely different than what you thought it was. Right. I think that is what we as marketers need to do better,
Right.
better stuff about. So I want to wrap it up. First of all, thanks for coming, man.
Pleasure.
This has been great. I know people will probably look you up, and you got your website right there. So,
Let me see
uh,
it.
just contact them if you're interested. Look, I've had a couple conversations with Clay over email and pre-calls and stuff. I get the feeling that he's the type of guy that will spend some time with marketers who are struggling in many different areas to identify, is this a solution for you? Maybe you need to wait. Maybe you're in a lull, and you just kind of want to try new things. And I think that's really important. I also want to thank everybody for your continued interest in Email Never Sleeps. We've evolved this podcast over the period of the last several years. We've seen a lot of changes on our end, right? And you guys
Sure.
continue to support us and help us. And obviously, we bring on guests like Clay, right, who can kind of give a different perspective to maybe what could potentially be somewhat controversial, at least in the email space and the privacy space and compliance space. But I think we're evolving as marketers. And Clay, I wanted to thank you again for your time, your knowledge, your patience, and most importantly, for creating this solution, especially given your background. So thank you
Yeah, it was
so
a
much.
pleasure.
Awesome. Everybody, thanks again. Look forward to our next podcast coming out probably in July. I look forward to that, and thank you again, everybody, for all of your attention.